Blood soaked through Josephine James's skirts as she propped herself against a boulder, the sun beating down mercilessly on her pale face. The overland stagecoach had disappeared over the horizon, taking with it her last hope of reaching California. The driver had claimed her screams were disrupting the other passengers, her broken leg an inconvenience they could no longer bear. "We ain't a hospital wagon," he'd spat before ordering her belongings tossed to the ground. Now, as the Nevada desert stretched endlessly around her, Josephine knew that death was merely waiting for an introduction. The year was 1871, and the promise of a teaching position in Sacramento had lured Josephine from her safe but stifling life in Boston. At 23, she had been determined to forge her own path, away from disappointed parents who couldn't understand why their only daughter rejected marriage proposals from perfectly suitable gentlemen. The journey west had been grueling but bearable until the stagecoach hit a deep rut outside of Reno. The violent jolt had sent her tumbling against the door, which swung open. The resulting fall had left her with a grotesquely angled leg and a driver who viewed her injury as an inconvenience rather than a crisis. Pain radiated from her leg in pulsing waves. Josephine had tied her shawl around the injury, but the makeshift bandage did little to stem the bleeding or align the broken bone. She squinted at the horizon, hoping against hope that someone would appear, but the trail remained empty. Her throat was already parched, and she had only a single canteen of water. Desperation clawed at her as she realized the terrible truth: she had survived 23 years of life only to die alone in the desert. The sound came so gradually that Josephine first mistook it for the wind. But as it grew louder, she recognized the steady rhythm of hooves striking hard-packed earth. Summoning what remained of her strength, she waved her handkerchief above her head. "Help!" Her voice emerged as a croak. "Please help." The rider appeared over a low rise, silhouetted against the blazing sky. For a moment, Josephine feared he might pass by without noticing her, but then the horse changed direction, approaching at a canter. As horse and rider drew closer, she made out the broad-brimmed hat, dusty denim, and weathered leather that marked him as a cowboy. The man reined his horse to a stop several feet away. "Madam," his voice carried concern as he dismounted in one fluid motion. "You hurt?" "My leg," Josephine managed, gesturing toward the injury. "The stagecoach, they left me." The cowboy crouched beside her, pushing back his hat to reveal a face tanned by years under the sun. His eyes, a startling blue against his weathered skin, narrowed as he examined her injury. "Name's Matthew Prescott," he said, gently moving aside the blood-soaked fabric of her dress. "Ranch foreman over at Silvercrest. What's yours?" "Josephine James." She winced as his fingers probed near the brake. "I was traveling to Sacramento for a teaching position." Matthew's expression darkened. "They left you here to die with a broken leg, damn their eyes." He looked up at her, and Josephine saw genuine anger flash across his features. "I've seen some low things in my time, but this—" He shook his head. "Can you help me?" Josephine asked, hating how weak and desperate she sounded. "Yes, madam, I can and will." Matthew stood and walked to his horse. "I've got supplies. We need to set that leg proper before we go anywhere." Josephine watched as he returned with a saddlebag. His movements were efficient as he laid out bandages, 2 straight branches he must have collected earlier, and a flask. "This is going to hurt something fierce," he warned, offering her the flask. "Whiskey, not proper for a lady, I reckon, but it'll help with the pain." Josephine had never tasted alcohol before, but she took a reluctant sip. The liquid burned a path down her throat, making her cough and sputter. "More," Matthew encouraged. "You'll want to be half numb for what comes next." She complied, and the second swallow went down easier. A warm numbness began to spread through her limbs, but nothing could fully prepare her for what followed. When Matthew straightened her leg to align the broken bone, Josephine's world exploded into white-hot agony. Her scream echoed across the empty landscape before darkness mercifully claimed her. When she regained consciousness, her leg was bound between 2 wooden splints, the bleeding stanched. Matthew knelt beside her, his expression concerned. "You back with me, Miss James?" I think so, she whispered, surprised by how steady his hands had been during such a gruesome task. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, we've still got a problem. Matthew glanced at the horizon. Nearest town's Verde, and that's 40 miles east of here. My ranch is about the same distance south. 40 miles, the number seemed insurmountable. My horse can't carry double for that long in this heat. Not at any pace that wouldn't jostle your leg something awful. He studied her face. And leaving you to fetch help is too risky. Coyotes get brave after sundown, and that's not mentioning the two-legged predators that might come along. What then? Josephine asked, fighting rising panic. Matthew's jaw set in a determined line. Only one way I can see. I'll have to carry me, 40 miles. The proposal seemed absurd. We'll use my horse for your belongings. I'll carry you and we'll lead him. Matthew's voice held no doubt. It'll take days, but I know where to find water and shelter. I was heading to Verde anyway. Josephine stared at him, searching for any sign of hesitation. She found none. Why would you do this for a stranger? Matthew's expression softened. My ma raised me to believe we're put on this earth to help each other through it. I can't leave you here any more than I could leave a wounded animal to suffer. He stood. Rest a bit more while I get things ready. We'll need to move before the day gets any hotter. As Matthew prepared for their journey, Josephine observed him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to solving problems and facing challenges. His hands, calloused from years of ranch work, were nonetheless gentle as he packed her meager belongings onto his horse. There was something reassuring about his presence, a steadiness that made her believe they might actually survive this ordeal. Ready? He asked, returning to her side. Josephine nodded, though dread pooled in her stomach at the thought of being moved. As I'll ever be. With careful movements, Matthew slid one arm behind her back and the other beneath her knees. On 3, he warned. 1, 2, 3. He lifted her in one smooth motion, but even so, the pain made her gasp. She clutched at his shirt, her fingers digging into the worn fabric. Breathe through it, he murmured. That's it. Gradually, the white-hot pain subsided to a more manageable throb. Josephine became acutely aware of how close she was to this stranger, close enough to feel the steady beat of his heart, to smell the leather and sun-warmed cotton of his clothes. I must be terribly heavy, she said, embarrassed by her helplessness. Matthew adjusted his hold, securing her more firmly against his chest. I've carried newborn calves heavier than you, Miss James. A smile touched the corners of his mouth, though they generally smell worse. Despite everything, Josephine found herself laughing, a small, startled sound that surprised them both. That's better, Matthew said, his blue eyes crinkling slightly at the corners. A sense of humor will serve you well on this journey. He nodded toward the east. Verde's that way. Best we get started. With that, he began walking, leading his horse by the reins looped around one wrist. His stride was steady and sure, making Josephine marvel at his strength. She had never been so completely dependent on anyone in her adult life, and the feeling was both terrifying and strangely comforting. As the sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky, Josephine realized that they were literally putting her life in this cowboy's hands. Matthew Prescott, a man she had known for less than an hour, had committed himself to a Herculean task on her behalf. The enormity of what he was undertaking left her humbled and overwhelmed with gratitude. Mr. Prescott, she said softly. Matthew, he corrected. If I'm going to carry you 40 miles, I reckon we can dispense with formalities. Matthew, she amended, I don't know how I'll ever repay this kindness. He glanced down at her, perspiration already beading on his forehead from the exertion and heat. Stay alive, Miss James. That'll be payment enough. The desert stretched before them, shimmering under the merciless sun. 40 miles, it seemed an impossible distance. Yet as Josephine settled against Matthew's chest, listening to his steady heartbeat, she found herself believing that if anyone could accomplish this feat of endurance, it would be the determined cowboy who now held her life in his arms. The first mile passed in relative silence, with only the sound of Matthew's boots crunching against the dry earth and the occasional snort from his horse. Josephine tried to make herself as light as possible, though she knew it was a futile effort. Every step must be agony for him, yet his face betrayed no strain beyond the sheen of sweat on his brow. "Tell me about your ranch," she said, hoping conversation might distract them both from the task ahead. Silvercrest. The name rolled off his tongue with clear pride. "It's not mine, properly speaking. Belongs to Jacob Whitmore. I've been foreman there 8 years now, started as a regular hand when I was 17. 8 years. Josephine did the quick calculation. That would make you around 25, 27, he corrected. Spent a couple years drifting before I found Silvercrest. Best decision I ever made. We run about 600 head of cattle, employ 12 men year-round, good men mostly." A smile flickered across his face. "Except maybe Pete Wilson, who cheats at cards and can't cook worth a damn. But he can track a stray calf through a dust storm, so we keep him around." Josephine found herself smiling at the affection in his voice. "It sounds like a family, closest thing to one I've got." Something in his tone made her wonder about his past, but she didn't press. "What about you? What brings a Boston lady all the way out here for a teaching position?" Her surprise must have shown on her face because he chuckled. "Your accent," he explained. "Plus, those shoes weren't made for Western terrain." Josephine glanced down at her impractical boots, now scuffed and dusty. "You're very observant, have to be in my line of work." He adjusted his hold slightly, careful not to jar her leg. "So, Boston?" "Yes, born and raised," Josephine sighed. "I came west because I wanted something different. My parents had my life all planned out, marriage to a banker or lawyer, a house in the right neighborhood, children." She paused, feeling oddly vulnerable. "I wanted more." "Teaching doesn't seem like such a wild adventure," Matthew remarked. "It is when you're a woman doing it on your own terms." Josephine's voice grew stronger. "In Boston, I would have been teaching the children of the elite, instilling proper manners and enough literacy to read the Bible. In Sacramento, I'll be building a school where girls can learn mathematics and science alongside boys." Matthew glanced down at her, something like respect kindling in his eyes. "That's quite a vision." "It was," Josephine amended, suddenly remembering her current predicament. "If I ever make it there, you will." His voice held absolute certainty. "Though you might be arriving with a bit of a limp." As they continued their slow progress, the sun climbed higher, beating down with merciless intensity. Josephine could feel Matthew's shirt growing damp with exertion, but his pace remained steady. After what seemed like hours, he finally stopped beneath the sparse shade of a scrubby juniper. "Rest," Josephine insisted. "Please." Matthew carefully lowered her to the ground, propping her against the trunk of the tree. His breathing was labored, his face flushed from the heat and effort. He uncorked his canteen and offered it to her first. "Just a little," he instructed. "We need to make it last." Josephine took a careful sip, the tepid water feeling like heaven against her parched throat. She watched as Matthew drank sparingly before wetting his bandana and wiping his face. "How far have we come?" she asked. "About 5 miles, I reckon." Matthew squinted at the sun. "Making decent time, considering. 5 miles, only an eighth of the way." The realization was sobering. "You can't possibly carry me the entire distance." "Watch me," Matthew replied simply. He knelt beside her to check her splint. His fingers were gentle as they probed the makeshift bandage, ensuring the wood hadn't shifted. "How's the pain?" "Manageable," Josephine lied. In truth, each jostle sent spikes of agony through her leg, but the alternative, being left behind, was unthinkable. Matthew's eyes met hers, and she knew he saw through her brave front. "I've got some willow bark in my saddlebag. My mother swore by it for pain. It's bitter as sin, but it helps." As he prepared the remedy, steeping the bark in a small tin cup with water, Josephine studied him more carefully. His hands were calloused and strong, yet they moved with surprising delicacy. There was a small scar at the corner of his left eyebrow and another across the back of his right hand. His face, while weathered from years in the sun, retained a youthfulness around the eyes. "Here." He offered her the cup. "Drink it all." The concoction was indeed bitter, making Josephine grimace. Matthew laughed at her expression, a warm, rich sound that seemed at odds with their dire circumstances. "Sorry," he said, not sounding particularly apologetic. "Should have warned you it tastes like punishment." "I believe you did." Josephine replied, managing to finish the dreadful brew. Matthew tended to his horse next, giving the animal water and checking its hooves. The gelding nuzzled his shoulder affectionately, making Josephine smile. "He seems quite attached to you," she observed. "Copper's been with me 6 years." Matthew patted the horse's neck. "We understand each other." He glanced back at Josephine. "We should move on. I want to reach Sycamore Creek by nightfall. There's water there and better shelter." With that, he carefully lifted her again. Josephine couldn't help noticing how his muscles trembled slightly from the exertion of the first 5 miles, but his determination never wavered. As they set off again, she felt a strange mix of guilt and gratitude washing over her. "Thank you," she whispered, almost to herself. Matthew's arms tightened around her just slightly. "Don't thank me yet, Miss James. We've got a long way to go." The afternoon wore on, the landscape changing subtly as they traveled. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of juniper. Matthew's pace slowed, but he never stopped except for brief rests to drink water and check her splint. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Josephine found herself growing increasingly concerned about her rescuer. Matthew's breathing had become labored and sweat soaked through his shirt. Yet each time she suggested he rest, he merely shook his head and continued onward. "Just a bit further," he would say, his voice growing hoarser as the day progressed. When they finally reached Sycamore Creek, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. The creek was little more than a ribbon of water winding through the landscape, but the sight of it nearly brought tears to Josephine's eyes. Several ancient sycamore trees provided genuine shade, their gnarled branches reaching toward the darkening sky. Matthew set her down with exquisite care beneath the largest tree, then collapsed beside her, his chest heaving with exertion. For several minutes he simply lay there, recovering his strength. Josephine watched him with mounting concern. "Matthew," she ventured finally, "are you all right?" He turned his head toward her, managing a tired smile. "Just winded, Miss James, don't fret." With visible effort he pushed himself upright. "We need to make camp while there's still light." Despite his exhaustion, Matthew worked efficiently. He unsaddled Copper and led the horse to drink, then collected firewood and started a small blaze. From his saddlebags, he produced jerky and hardtack, along with a small pot for boiling water. "It's not much of a feast," he apologized, offering her a share of the provisions, "but it'll keep body and soul together." "It's perfect," Josephine assured him, suddenly realizing how hungry she was. The jerky was tough and salty, the hardtack nearly rock hard, but she couldn't remember food ever tasting better. As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped rapidly, a stark contrast to the day's heat. Matthew added more wood to the fire, then spread his bedroll near Josephine. "You should take it," she protested when he offered her the blanket. "I've slept on bare ground plenty of times," Matthew countered. "You need it more with that leg." Their compromise was to share it, with Matthew sitting propped against the tree and Josephine lying beside him, the blanket covering them both. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across their faces. "How did you become a cowboy?" Josephine asked, finding the silence comfortable but curious about her rescuer. Matthew stared into the flames. "My father was a farmer in Missouri, had a small place, grew corn and kept a few cows. When he died, I was 15. My mother tried to keep it going, but it was too much." His voice grew distant with memory. "A bad winter took her 2 years later, pneumonia. After that, there wasn't anything keeping me there." "I'm sorry," Josephine said softly. Touched by the simple tragedy of his story, Matthew shrugged. "It was a long time ago. I headed west, found work on cattle drives. Turned out I had a knack for it." A hint of pride crept into his voice. "Worked my way up to foreman quicker than most. And now you rescue damsels in distress," Josephine added, hoping to lighten the mood. It worked. Matthew's laugh was soft but genuine. "First time for everything, I suppose." He glanced down at her. "What about your family? Will they be waiting for you in Sacramento?" Josephine shook her head. "No, my parents made their feelings about my decision quite clear. My father said if I was determined to throw away my future on this foolish adventure, I shouldn't expect their support. The memory still stung. My mother couldn't understand why teaching children in California was any different from teaching them in Boston. And is it? Matthew asked, his gaze thoughtful. Yes, Josephine said firmly. In Boston, I would always be Miss James from the respected James family, expected to uphold certain standards and traditions. In Sacramento, I can simply be Josephine, judged on my own merits. Matthew nodded slowly. Freedom's a powerful draw. Yes, exactly. Josephine felt a rush of gratitude that he understood. Freedom to define my own life. They lapsed into silence, the fire popping occasionally. Despite the pain in her leg and the dire circumstances, Josephine felt oddly at peace. Perhaps it was the willow bark working its magic, or perhaps it was the steadfast presence of the man beside her. We should sleep, Matthew said eventually. Tomorrow will be another long day. Josephine nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. As she closed her eyes, she felt Matthew adjust the blanket around her shoulders. His kindness, given so freely and without expectation of reward, touched something deep within her. In Boston, she had met many men of wealth and education, men her parents deemed suitable matches. Yet none had shown the simple human decency that this cowboy had demonstrated in a single day. "Good night, Matthew," she murmured. "Good night, Miss James," came his quiet reply. "Rest easy now." As sleep claimed her, Josephine's last conscious thought was that she felt safer beside this stranger in the wilderness than she ever had in her parents' well-guarded home in Boston. Morning arrived with a chill that made Josephine burrow deeper under the blanket before memory returned. Her leg throbbed dully, a constant reminder of her predicament. She opened her eyes to find Matthew already awake, rekindling the fire with practiced efficiency. "How long have you been up?" she asked, her voice rough with sleep. Matthew glanced over, offering a brief smile. "Since first light." "Wanted to get a fire going before you woke. It gets cold in these parts at night." He looked exhausted. Josephine realized with a pang of guilt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his movements, while still purposeful, lacked yesterday's energy. Yet when he approached to check her splint, his touch remained gentle. "How's the pain this morning?" "Bearable," Josephine answered honestly. The night's rest had helped, though she dreaded the thought of being moved again. "How are you feeling?" Something like surprise flickered across Matthew's face, as though he wasn't accustomed to having his well-being inquired after. "I'm fine." "You're exhausted," Josephine countered gently. Matthew shrugged. "Nothing that won't be cured by breakfast and coffee." He returned to the fire, where water was beginning to boil in the small pot. "Hope you like your coffee strong. Cowboys don't much believe in moderation when it comes to brewing." The coffee, when it was ready, was indeed strong enough to stand a spoon in, but Josephine found its bitter warmth surprisingly welcome. Matthew produced more jerky for breakfast, along with a few dried apples that were a sweet contrast to the salted meat. "We've covered about 10 miles, Matthew said as they ate. "That leaves 30 to go. If we keep a steady pace, we should reach Verde in 3 days. 3 more days of being carried across rough terrain." Josephine couldn't imagine how Matthew would manage it, but she had already learned that arguing with his determination was futile. "What business did you have in Verde?" she asked instead, remembering he'd mentioned he was heading there anyway. "Cattle sale," Matthew replied. "Mr. Whitmore's looking to add some new breeding stock. I was riding ahead to make arrangements." Josephine frowned. "Won't he be expecting you? What if he sends someone looking when you don't arrive?" "He might, but they'd take the main trail. We're cutting cross-country." Matthew drained the last of his coffee. "Besides, he knows I can handle myself, won't start worrying for at least a week." As Matthew broke camp and saddled Copper, Josephine couldn't help noticing how he winced when lifting the saddle, the muscles in his back and shoulders clearly protesting after yesterday's exertion. Yet he made no complaint, simply completing each task with quiet efficiency. When it came time to continue their journey, Matthew approached her with a determined expression. "Ready?" Josephine nodded, bracing herself for the pain of being moved. As Matthew lifted her, she did her best to suppress a gasp, not wanting to add to his burden with her discomfort. He settled her against his chest with the same care as before, but she could feel the subtle trembling of his muscles. Matthew, she began, perhaps we need to make good time while it's still cool, he interrupted, already starting forward with his steady stride. The terrain gets rougher ahead. He was right about the terrain. As the day progressed, they moved through rocky foothills that required careful navigation. Matthew's pace slowed, each step deliberately placed to avoid jostling Josephine's injured leg. The physical toll on him was evident. Perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the milder temperature, and his breathing grew increasingly labored. By midday, when they stopped to rest, Matthew's face had gone alarmingly pale beneath his tan. He lowered Josephine to a comfortable spot before walking a few steps away and bending over, hands on his knees, clearly fighting exhaustion. "We need to stop for longer," Josephine insisted. "You can't continue like this." Matthew straightened with visible effort. "We can't afford to lose daylight, and I can't afford to have you collapse from exhaustion," Josephine countered. "Please, Matthew, just an hour's rest." Something in her voice must have reached him, for he nodded reluctantly. An hour, no more. He sank down beside her, leaning against a boulder and closing his eyes briefly. Josephine studied his profile, the strong line of his jaw now set with determination, the furrow between his brows that spoke of pain he refused to acknowledge. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Matthew's eyes opened, finding hers. "Doing what? Pushing yourself to the breaking point for a stranger?" For a moment he was silent, as though the question had never occurred to him. "It's the right thing to do," he said finally. "That's reason enough. Most men would have considered taking me to the nearest settlement and leaving me in someone else's care to be the right thing," Josephine pointed out. A smile tugged at the corner of Matthew's mouth. "Perhaps I'm not most men." "No," Josephine agreed quietly. "You most certainly are not." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits. Despite their different backgrounds and experiences, they shared a stubborn determination that defied conventional expectations. The hour passed too quickly. True to his word, Matthew rose after exactly 60 minutes, his jaw set with renewed determination. As they continued their journey, Josephine found herself talking more, sharing stories of her life in Boston and her dreams for the school in Sacramento. She hoped conversation might distract Matthew from his physical discomfort, and indeed, he seemed to welcome the exchange, offering anecdotes about ranch life in return. "There was this one calf," he recounted, his voice growing animated despite his exhaustion, "smallest of the spring crop, born early in a snowstorm. Nobody thought she'd make it through the night. I sat up with her in the barn, wrapped her in blankets, fed her with a rag dipped in milk." "Did she survive?" Josephine asked, caught up in the story. Matthew's face brightened with genuine pride. "Not only survived, she grew into one of our best breeding cows, named her Miracle. She's produced some of the finest calves on Silvercrest." "You saved her life," Josephine observed. "Sometimes all it takes is someone refusing to give up," Matthew replied. And Josephine knew he wasn't just talking about the calf. As afternoon stretched toward evening, the landscape changed again, giving way to a sparse forest of pines and junipers. The shade was welcome, but the uneven ground made progress even slower. Matthew's strength was clearly flagging, his steps becoming less sure as exhaustion took its toll. "There's a hunter's cabin about a mile ahead," he said, his voice rough with fatigue. "We can shelter there tonight." Josephine could feel his heart hammering against her side, his breathing increasingly labored. "Matthew, please," she begged. "You need to rest." He shook his head stubbornly. "After we reach the cabin." The next mile was the longest of Josephine's life. With each step, she feared Matthew might collapse beneath the combined weight of her body and his own exhaustion. Yet somehow he continued forward, driven by a will that seemed inexhaustible. When the cabin finally came into view, a crude, one-room structure nestled among the trees, Josephine nearly cried with relief. Matthew staggered the last few yards, shouldering open the door before carefully depositing her on a rough wooden bunk. Then, his strength finally spent, he sank to the floor beside her, head bowed, chest heaving. "Matthew," alarm shot through Josephine as she reached for him. "Matthew, I'm all right," he managed, though his voice was barely audible. "Just need a minute." Josephine watched helplessly as he struggled to regain his composure. After several minutes, he pushed himself upright with trembling arms. "Need to tend to Copper," he mumbled, lurching toward the door. "Matthew Prescott, you will do no such thing until you've rested," Josephine said, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she'd used with recalcitrant students during her brief teaching experience in Boston. Matthew paused, looking back at her with a mixture of surprise and amusement. "Are you giving me orders, Miss James?" "Yes," Josephine replied firmly, "and if you have any sense at all, you'll follow them. You're of no use to either of us if you work yourself into collapse." For a moment she thought he might argue, but then, unexpectedly, he laughed a short, breathless sound. "You'd have made a fine foreman, Miss James." He leaned against the doorframe, clearly grateful for the support. 10 minutes, then I need to see to the horse." It was a compromise, and Josephine accepted it as the best she could hope for. 10 minutes, she agreed. While Matthew rested, Josephine took stock of their shelter. The cabin was dusty but sound, with a small fireplace, a rough table, and 2 bunks. Previous occupants had left a stack of firewood, and to her surprise, some basic provisions: beans, coffee, and flour stored in tightly sealed tins to protect them from rodents. When Matthew returned from tending to Copper, some color had returned to his face, though exhaustion still lined every feature. He built a fire in the small hearth and prepared a meal that, while simple, was more substantial than jerky and hardtack. "Where did you learn to cook?" Josephine asked as they ate beans warmed over the fire. "Self-preservation," Matthew replied with a half-smile. "Man either learns to cook on the range or starves." As night settled around the cabin, the warmth of the fire and the relative comfort of actual walls created an atmosphere of unexpected intimacy. Seated on the floor near Josephine's bunk, Matthew checked her splint, his fingers gentle as they examined the swelling. "The break's clean," he observed. "Should heal well with proper care." "How do you know so much about setting bones?" Josephine asked. "When you work with livestock, injuries happen." Matthew carefully rewrapped the splint. "And doctors are few and far between out here. You learn to make do." His hand lingered on her ankle a moment longer than necessary, and Josephine felt a curious warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. Their eyes met, and something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of connection that transcended their brief acquaintance. Matthew looked away first, clearing his throat. "You should get some rest. I'll take the other bunk." As Josephine settled beneath the blanket he provided, she watched Matthew move around the cabin, banking the fire for the night. Despite 2 days of grueling physical exertion, his movements retained a certain grace, the unconscious elegance of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Matthew," she called softly as he prepared to retire to the other bunk. He paused, looking toward her. "Yes, thank you." "Not just for the rescue, but for—" She gestured vaguely, searching for words. "For treating me like a person worth saving. Not everyone would." Matthew's expression softened. "Anyone worth their salt would do the same." "We both know that's not true," Josephine replied. The stagecoach driver and passengers proved that well enough. A flash of anger crossed Matthew's features at the mention of her abandonment. "Some folks forget their humanity when it becomes inconvenient." He shook his head. "But that's not a mistake I aim to make." As Matthew settled on the other bunk, Josephine found herself wondering about the life he led, the daily challenges and quiet triumphs that had shaped him into the man who would undertake a 40-mile journey on foot to save a stranger. There was a depth to him that belied his simple cowboy appearance, a moral certainty that she found both comforting and intriguing. Sleep came more easily that night, cushioned by the relative comfort of the bunk and the security of solid walls around them. But before surrendering to slumber, Josephine found herself watching the steady rise and fall of Matthew's chest in the bunk across from hers, grateful beyond words for his presence in what might otherwise have been the last days of her life. The 3rd day of their journey dawned gray and threatening. Matthew frowned at the clouds gathering on the horizon as they prepared to leave the cabin. "Storm coming," he observed, his expression concerned. "We need to make good time before it hits." Despite the night's rest, Matthew still moved stiffly, his body protesting the demands he'd placed upon it. Yet when he lifted Josephine, his grip remained sure, his determination undiminished. "How far to Verdi now?" Josephine asked as they set out. "About 20 miles, Matthew replied. "But this terrain is more forgiving than yesterday's. We might make better time." The air grew heavy as the morning progressed, the promised storm gathering strength. By midday, distant thunder rumbled across the sky and the wind had picked up, bringing with it the scent of rain. "There's a line shack about 5 miles ahead," Matthew said, picking up his pace. "If we can reach it before the storm breaks." They didn't make it. 3 miles from the shack, the skies opened, releasing a deluge that soaked them within minutes. Matthew hunched protectively over Josephine, trying to shield her from the worst of the rain, but it was a losing battle. Cold water ran in rivulets down their faces, plastering clothing to skin. "Hold tight," Matthew shouted over the storm's roar. "Almost there." The rain turned the trail to mud, making each step treacherous. Twice Matthew nearly fell, catching himself at the last moment through sheer determination. Josephine clung to him, terrified that a fall might re-injure her leg or worse, hurt Matthew himself. When the line shack finally appeared through the curtain of rain, a crude structure even smaller than the previous night's cabin, it seemed like salvation. Matthew staggered the last few yards, shouldering the door open with desperate strength. Inside, they found a dirt floor, a tiny stove, and little else. But it was dry, and at that moment, that was miracle enough. Matthew set Josephine down carefully before collapsing beside her, rain dripping from his clothes to form puddles on the packed earth floor. For several minutes, he simply sat there, head bowed, regaining his strength. Josephine reached out impulsively, pushing wet hair back from his forehead. "You're freezing," she said, alarmed by the coldness of his skin. "So are you," Matthew countered, his eyes taking in her sodden dress and pale face. With visible effort, he rose and moved to the small stove. "Need to get a fire going." The shack's previous occupants had left some kindling and wood stored in a box beside the stove to keep it dry. Matthew's hands trembled as he arranged the kindling, but soon a small flame flickered to life, growing steadily stronger. "We need to get out of these wet clothes," Matthew said matter-of-factly, though a flush that had nothing to do with exertion colored his cheeks. "You'll catch your death otherwise." Josephine felt heat rise to her own face at the suggestion, but the practicality of the situation overrode conventional propriety. They were both soaked to the skin, miles from civilization, with a storm raging outside. Modesty was a luxury they couldn't afford. Matthew rummaged in his saddlebags, which had been somewhat protected from the rain by the oilskin cover he'd thrown over them. "I've got a spare shirt," he said, offering her the garment. "It's not much, but it's dry." "Thank you," Josephine said, accepting the shirt with grateful hands. "But how will I?" Understanding her dilemma, Matthew turned his back. "I won't look. Just tell me when you need help." The task of changing proved more challenging than Josephine had anticipated. With her leg immobilized by the splint, simply removing her sodden dress required contortions that sent spikes of pain through her injured limb. After several frustrated attempts, she was forced to concede defeat. "Matthew," she called, embarrassment coloring her voice. "I need assistance." Matthew turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Tell me what to do." "The buttons," Josephine explained, gesturing to the back of her dress. "I can't reach them." With cautious movements, Matthew knelt beside her. His fingers were surprisingly deft as they worked the small buttons, though Josephine could feel them trembling slightly. The intimacy of the moment hung heavy in the air between them. "There," Matthew said, his voice rough as he finished the last button. "I'll turn around again." Once his back was turned, Josephine struggled out of the wet dress, leaving her in her damp chemise and petticoat. The latter was too wet to keep on, but removing it without standing proved impossible. "Matthew," she called again, mortification heating her cheeks. "My petticoat, I can't." Matthew kept his eyes carefully averted as he helped her, his hands businesslike but gentle. When at last she was clothed in his dry shirt, which hung to her knees like a tent, he released a breath that seemed to contain all the tension of the past minutes. Now you, Josephine insisted, noting how he shivered in his sodden clothing. Matthew hesitated, then nodded, retreating to the far corner of the tiny shack to change into his dry-clothes spare trousers and an undershirt that had also escaped the worst of the rain. Josephine kept her eyes fixed on the stove, giving him the same privacy he'd tried to afford her. When they were both relatively dry, Matthew hung their wet clothing near the stove to dry. The storm continued to rage outside, wind howling around the small structure, rain pounding on the roof with relentless fury. "Looks like we're staying put for a while," Matthew observed, settling beside Josephine near the stove. The warmth of the fire was beginning to chase away the bone-deep chill, bringing feeling back to numbed extremities. "I'm sorry," Josephine said, watching as Matthew rubbed his hands together near the flames. "This delay is my fault." Matthew looked at her, genuine surprise in his eyes. "How do you figure that? If you weren't burdened with me, you could have outrun the storm, been in Verdi by now." "If I weren't burdened with you, as you put it," Matthew countered, "I'd have ridden straight past you 2 days ago and you'd be—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. They both knew what fate would have awaited her, alone in the desert with a broken leg. "Still," Josephine insisted, "you've suffered greatly on my account. Your shoulders must be in agony from carrying me." A smile tugged at Matthew's mouth. "They felt better," he admitted, "but I've had worse from breaking wild horses." Josephine shook her head, marveling at his persistent optimism. "You're a strange man, Matthew Prescott." "How's that?" he asked, genuine curiosity in his voice. "Most men would be cursing their luck, stuck in a lined shack during a storm with a helpless woman." "You're hardly helpless," Matthew observed. "Wounded, yes, but I suspect you're made of sterner stuff than most men I know." The compliment warmed Josephine more than the fire. In Boston, she had been praised for her beauty, her accomplishments on the pianoforte, her fine needlework, never for her strength or resilience. Yet this cowboy had seen those qualities in her without being told to look. They sat in companionable silence as the storm raged on, the small stove providing both warmth and comfort. Eventually, Matthew produced the last of their provisions, jerky and a few dried apples, and they shared the meager meal. "Tomorrow we should reach Verdi, weather permitting," Matthew said, gazing into the fire. "There's a doctor there, not much of one from what I hear, but he should be able to set your leg properly." Josephine nodded, trying to ignore the strange pang she felt at the thought of their journey ending. "And then you'll continue on to your cattle sale. That's the plan." Matthew glanced at her. "What about you? Will you continue to Sacramento?" "I must," Josephine replied, though the thought of traveling alone again after all that had happened filled her with dread. "My position awaits." Matthew nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Sacramento's not so far from Silvercrest, perhaps. Once you're settled, I could ride up that way, see how you're faring." The suggestion, offered with careful casualness, made Josephine's heart beat a little faster. "I'd like that," she said softly. Their eyes met across the small space between them, and Josephine felt something shift, a subtle realignment of possibilities. In the space of 3 days, this man had become more than a rescuer, more than a traveling companion. He had become someone whose absence she would feel keenly. The realization was both thrilling and terrifying. As night fell and the storm continued unabated, they prepared for sleep as best they could. The shack offered no bunks, only the hard-packed dirt floor. Matthew insisted Josephine take his bedroll, which had remained relatively dry inside its oilskin wrapping. "What about you?" she protested. "I'll manage," he assured her, fashioning a makeshift pillow from his saddle blanket. But as the temperature dropped and the wind found every crack in the shack's rough walls, Josephine could see Matthew shivering despite his proximity to the stove. Without allowing herself to overthink, she lifted the edge of the blanket. "This is ridiculous," she said firmly. "We'll both freeze separately, share the blanket." Matthew hesitated, propriety warring with practical necessity. "Miss James, I couldn't." "Josephine," she interrupted. "After all this, I think you've earned the right to use my given name, and I insist. We're both adults, and these are extraordinary circumstances." After another moment's hesitation, Matthew nodded and cautiously joined her beneath the blanket, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the limited space. They lay side by side, the warmth of their bodies gradually creating a cocoon of comfort beneath the woolen cover. "Good night, Josephine," Matthew said softly, the use of her given name somehow more intimate than their shared blanket. "Good night, Matthew," she replied, acutely aware of his presence beside her, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the faint scent of leather and pine that clung to him even after days on the trail. As sleep claimed her, Josephine found herself drawing closer to Matthew's warmth, her body seeking comfort in his proximity. And if, during the night, his arm came to rest protectively across her waist, neither of them mentioned it when morning came. The storm passed during the night, leaving behind a washed, clean world gleaming with raindrops under the morning sun. Their clothing, hung near the stove, had dried sufficiently to be wearable if somewhat rumpled. "We should reach Verdi by midday," Matthew said as they prepared to leave the shack. "The trail will be muddy but passable." Josephine nodded, feeling a curious mix of anticipation and regret. Verdi represented safety, medical care, civilization, all things she desperately needed. Yet it also meant the end of this strange journey with Matthew, a parting that seemed to come too soon despite the physical hardships they'd endured. As Matthew lifted her for what would be the final leg of their journey, Josephine found herself studying his face, memorizing the exact shade of his blue eyes, the way sunlight caught in his hair, the lines at the corners of his mouth that deepened when he smiled. She wanted to preserve these details, to carry them with her to Sacramento and beyond. The last miles passed too quickly. The muddy trail gave way to a more established road, and signs of civilization began to appear: fenced pastures, the occasional farmstead, finally the outskirts of Verdi itself. With each step, Matthew's pace seemed to slow, as though he too felt reluctant to reach their destination. Verdi was a typical Western town, a main street lined with wooden buildings, horses hitched to rails, people going about their business with the purposeful stride of those with somewhere to be. Their arrival caused a stir, heads turning to watch as Matthew carried Josephine down the center of the street. "The doctor's office should be this way," Matthew said, nodding toward a building with a painted sign advertising Dr. William Porter, physician and surgeon. Inside, they found a sparse waiting room and a harried-looking man in his 50s who introduced himself as Dr. Porter. His eyebrows rose at the sight of Matthew carrying Josephine. "What have we here?" he asked, gesturing toward an examination table. As Matthew carefully placed Josephine on the table, she found herself reluctant to release her hold on his shirt. For days, his arms had been her safety, his determination her hope. Letting go felt somehow like stepping off a cliff. "Broken leg," Matthew explained to the doctor. "Said it as best I could in the field, but it needs proper attention." Dr. Porter nodded, already examining the splint. "And how did this happen?" Briefly, Matthew related their story: the stagecoach abandonment, the makeshift splint, the 40-mile journey. With each word, the doctor's eyebrows climbed higher. "You carried her 40 miles?" he asked incredulously. "On foot, thereabouts," Matthew replied, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Well, miss." The doctor looked at Josephine questioningly. "James," she supplied. "Josephine James. Miss James, you're fortunate this young man found you, and even more fortunate that he knew how to set a brake properly. From what I can see, the alignment is good. We'll need to replace this field splint with a proper cast, but I believe you'll heal without complications." Relief washed over Josephine, followed immediately by the realization that with medical care secured, there was no longer any reason for Matthew to remain. The thought sent a spike of panic through her that had nothing to do with her injury. "I'll need to remove your dress to examine the leg fully," Dr. Porter continued. "Perhaps your husband would like to wait outside. He's not." Josephine began, then faltered, suddenly uncertain how to define what Matthew was to her. Friend seemed inadequate, rescuer too clinical. "I'll wait outside," Matthew said, saving her from having to explain. "Send word when you're finished, doctor." As Matthew turned to go, Josephine called after him. "Matthew," he paused, looking back. "Yes, you will wait, not leave town." Something softened in his expression. I'll wait, he promised. I've come 40 miles with you, Josephine. I can manage a few more hours. With that reassurance, she allowed Dr. Porter to proceed with his examination and treatment. The process was painful. The old splint removed, the break examined, a plaster cast applied but throughout. Josephine found strength in knowing Matthew was nearby. When at last the doctor pronounced himself satisfied with his work and helped her into a borrowed dressing gown, she felt both exhausted and relieved. "You're a lucky young woman," Dr. Porter remarked as he washed his hands. "The break was clean and your cowboy did an excellent job with the initial treatment. With proper rest, you should recover fully." "How long before I can travel?" Josephine asked, thinking of Sacramento. "Travel?" The doctor looked shocked. "My dear, you won't be traveling anywhere for at least 6 weeks. That bone needs time to knit properly." 6 weeks, Josephine repeated, dismayed. "But my position in Sacramento will have to wait," Dr. Porter said firmly, "unless you want to risk permanent lameness." The news was devastating. 6 weeks in Verde, a town where she knew no one, had no accommodations and limited funds. The school in Sacramento would surely give her position to someone else. When Matthew was allowed to return, he found Josephine fighting tears of frustration. One look at her face told him all he needed to know. "Bad news?" he asked gently, coming to stand beside the examination table. 6 weeks before I can travel," Josephine said, her voice trembling slightly. "The position in Sacramento will be gone by then." Matthew frowned, considering this development. "You need a place to stay while you recover," he stated, practical as always. "Dr. Porter, is there a boarding house in town that might accommodate Miss James?" "Mrs. Holloway runs a respectable establishment," the doctor replied. "But I'm not certain she has vacancies at present." Josephine's heart sank further. Without the promise of the teaching position, her funds were limited. She had planned her journey to Sacramento precisely, with little margin for unexpected delays or expenses. What about the hotel? Matthew suggested. "Expensive," Dr. Porter warned, "and not particularly comfortable for a long-term stay." Matthew's frown deepened as he considered their limited options. Then, unexpectedly, his expression cleared as though he'd reached a decision. "There's another possibility," he said, turning to Josephine. "Silvercrest, your ranch," Josephine asked, confused. "Mr. Whitmore's ranch," Matthew corrected. "But yes, it's only a day's ride from here. We have a proper house with a spare room, comfortable enough for someone recovering. And Mrs. Daniels, our cook, was a midwife back east. She knows a thing or two about nursing." The offer took Josephine's breath away. "You would do that, taking a stranger?" "You're hardly a stranger after what we've been through," Matthew pointed out, "and Mr. Whitmore is a decent man. He wouldn't turn away someone in need, especially not someone I've vouched for." "But what would I do there?" Josephine asked, practical concerns asserting themselves. "I can't simply be a charity case." A smile tugged at Matthew's lips. "As it happens, Mr. Whitmore's been looking for someone to teach his daughter. She's 12, bright as a new penny but too far from town to attend school regularly. Her mother tried, but..." His voice softened. "Mrs. Whitmore passed last winter, influenza." "I'm sorry," Josephine said automatically, though her mind was racing with possibilities. "He wants a governess. He wants his daughter educated," Matthew clarified. "By someone who knows what they're about. From what you've told me of your qualifications, you'd be perfect. And it would give you somewhere to stay while your leg heals." It was a solution so perfect, so unexpected, that Josephine hardly knew how to respond. "You think he would agree?" "I know he would," Matthew said confidently. "In fact, I was supposed to inquire about a governess while in Verde." "This just saves the trouble of interviewing candidates." Dr. Porter, who had been listening to this exchange with interest, nodded approvingly. "It sounds ideal, Miss James. Rural life is healthy, and having proper care during your recovery will make all the difference." Then, "Yes," Josephine decided, a weight lifting from her shoulders. "If Mr. Whitmore agrees, I would be most grateful for the position." Matthew's smile widened, genuine pleasure in his eyes. "Good. I'll send a telegram to the ranch today, letting them know we'll be arriving tomorrow." He glanced at the doctor. "Assuming travel is permissible, by wagon with proper padding and care, yes. Dr. Porter confirmed. "I'll provide laudanum for the journey if the pain becomes too severe." As arrangements were made for Josephine's temporary accommodation at the town's hotel and their departure the following day, she found herself watching Matthew with new eyes. In the space of a few days, her life had been completely upended first by disaster, then by the unexpected kindness of a man who had no reason to help her beyond his own moral compass. That night, alone in her hotel room, Josephine found herself unable to sleep despite her exhaustion. For the first time in days, she wasn't within arm's reach of Matthew, and his absence felt strangely disorienting. She had grown accustomed to his steady presence, his quiet strength, the sound of his breathing in the darkness. More unsettling were the feelings that had begun to take root during their journey, feelings that went beyond gratitude or friendship. There was an understanding between them that defied their brief acquaintance, a connection forged through shared hardship and mutual respect. Josephine had never believed in the romantic notion of love at first sight. In Boston, courtship was a carefully orchestrated dance of social calls, chaperoned outings, and proper introductions. Yet here, in the wild territory of Nevada, she had formed a deeper bond with Matthew Prescott in 4 days than with any suitor over months of proper courtship. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. What did it mean for her future, for the independence she had so fiercely sought? And most importantly, did Matthew feel the same connection, or was she simply a responsibility he had shouldered and would soon set aside? Morning brought no clear answers, but it did bring Matthew, arriving at the hotel with a rented wagon outfitted with blankets and pillows to cushion Josephine's journey. "Mr. Whitmore sent a reply," he announced as he carefully helped her into the wagon. "He's delighted at the prospect of a governess for Abigail and says your room will be ready by the time we arrive." "That's very kind of him," Josephine replied, settling among the blankets. "I hope I can meet his expectations." "You'll exceed them," Matthew said with simple confidence, climbing onto the driver's bench. "Ready." As the wagon pulled away from Verde, heading south towards Silvercrest Ranch, Josephine felt a curious sense of rightness, as though the disastrous breaking of her leg had somehow set her on a path she was meant to travel. It wasn't the future she had planned in Sacramento, but it held promise nonetheless. The journey to Silvercrest took the better part of a day, the wagon's steady pace much gentler than their previous travel but still taxing on Josephine's injured leg. Matthew stopped frequently to ensure her comfort, his concern evident in every glance. As they traveled, he told her more about the ranch and its inhabitants. Mr. Whitmore, a widower in his 40s who had built Silvercrest from nothing. His daughter Abigail, intelligent and spirited. Mrs. Daniels, the formidable cook who mothered everyone on the property, and the various cowboys who made up the ranch's workforce. "They're a good bunch, mostly," Matthew assured her. "Rough around the edges but respectful. You won't have any trouble from them, and my duties." Josephine asked, wanting to be prepared. "Beyond teaching Abigail, I mean." Matthew considered this. "That would be between you and Mr. Whitmore, but I imagine it would mainly be education. Abigail needs more than just reading and sums now: history, literature, sciences. Things her father can't provide." "And where will I teach? Is there a schoolroom?" "The house has a library," Matthew replied. "Small but adequate, I'd think. Mrs. Whitmore used it for Abigail's lessons before." As they talked, the landscape changed subtly, the terrain becoming more varied with rolling hills and stands of pine. By late afternoon, they crested a rise and Matthew reined in the horses. "There," he said, pointing ahead. "Silvercrest." Josephine's first glimpse of the ranch took her breath away. Nestled in a broad valley with mountains rising in the distance, it was larger and more established than she had imagined. A substantial main house of hewn logs stood at the center, surrounded by various outbuildings, barns, bunkhouses, corrals filled with horses and cattle. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods and willows. "It's beautiful," she said honestly. Matthew nodded, pride evident in his expression. "Mr. Whitmore chose well when he settled here. Good water, shelter from the worst storms, grazing land that stays green most of the year. As they approached the main house, activity stirred around the property. A man emerged from the house tall, broad-shouldered, with iron-gray hair and a neatly trimmed beard. Behind him came a girl on the cusp of womanhood, her brown hair in a long braid, curiosity evident in her stance. "That's Mr. Whitmore and Abigail," Matthew explained as he guided the wagon to a stop before the house. "Ready to meet your new employers?" Before Josephine could answer, Mr. Whitmore strode forward, his expression breaking into a warm smile as he recognized Matthew. "Prescott. Beginning to think you'd gotten lost." His voice was deep and resonant, his handshake firm as Matthew jumped down from the wagon. "This must be Miss James, sir," Matthew nodded respectfully. "Miss Josephine James, formerly of Boston, most recently of a stagecoach that deserves to be run out of business." Mr. Whitmore's eyebrows rose at the edge in Matthew's voice, but his manner remained cordial as he approached the wagon. "Miss James, welcome to Silvercrest. My foreman's telegram explained your unfortunate situation. I hope you'll find comfort here while you recover." "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore," Josephine replied, warmed by his genuine welcome. "Your generosity is most appreciated." "Not at all," he waved away her thanks. "Any friend of Prescott's is welcome here, and we've been in dire need of a governess for young Abigail." He gestured to the girl, who had been hanging back shyly. "Come say hello to Miss James, Abby." Abigail approached the wagon, her expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Hello, Miss James," she said politely. "I'm very sorry about your leg." "Thank you, Abigail," Josephine replied, charmed by the girl's direct manner. "I understand you'll be my student." "Yes, madam." A spark of interest lit Abigail's eyes. "Do you know about astronomy?" "Father bought me a telescope, but we can't make sense of the star charts." "I've studied astronomy, yes," Josephine confirmed, pleased by the girl's enthusiasm. "Perhaps we can explore the night sky together once I'm more mobile." This answer clearly satisfied Abigail, who beamed at her father. "I like her already." Mr. Whitmore laughed, a warm, rich sound. "That's settled then. Prescott, help Miss James into the house. Mrs. Daniels has prepared the blue room for her." With that, Matthew carefully lifted Josephine from the wagon, the familiar sensation of being in his arms now overlaid with a strange shyness. They were no longer alone on the trail, but surrounded by people who watched their interaction with interest. The interior of the Whitmore home surprised Josephine with its refinement. While built of rough logs on the outside, within it was comfortably appointed with quality furniture, woven rugs, and tasteful decorations that spoke of a woman's touch preserved even after her passing. The Blue Room, as it was called, was a pleasant chamber on the ground floor, sparing Josephine the challenge of stairs. It contained a comfortable bed with a handmade quilt, a washstand, dresser, and a window that looked out onto a small garden. "Mrs. Daniels thought you'd be more comfortable down here with your injury," Mr. Whitmore explained as Matthew set her gently on the bed. "She'll be in shortly to help you get settled." As if summoned by her name, a stout woman in her 50s appeared in the doorway, her capable hands already busy with a tray bearing tea and biscuits. "So this is our invalid," she said briskly, though her eyes were kind. "Looking better than I expected after what Mr. Prescott described in his telegram. I'm Agnes Daniels, cook and housekeeper. Pleased to meet you, Mrs. Daniels," Josephine replied. "I hope I won't be too much trouble." "Nonsense," the older woman dismissed. "This house has been wanting for female company since Mrs. Whitmore passed. Now, gentlemen, out with you. Miss James needs rest and refreshment, not an audience." With that, she shooed both men from the room, closing the door firmly behind them. Turning back to Josephine, her expression softened. "Now then, dear, let's get you comfortable and properly fed. You look like you've been through the wars." Over the next hour, Mrs. Daniels proved herself a capable and efficient nurse, helping Josephine wash away the dust of travel, change into a borrowed nightgown, and settle comfortably in the bed with her injured leg properly supported. Throughout, she kept up a steady stream of conversation, filling Josephine in on the household routines and personalities. "Mr. Whitmore's a good man," she confided as she poured tea. Hard-working, fair-minded, took his wife's passing hard, but he's bearing up for Abigail's sake. The girl's the light of his life. And Matthew? Josephine asked, trying to sound merely curious. He seems very devoted to the ranch. Prescott, Mrs. Daniels smiled knowingly. Best foreman in 3 counties, could have his own spread by now if he wanted, but he's loyal to Mr. Whitmore. Keeps to himself mostly, but there's not a man on the place who wouldn't ride through fire if he asked it. She eyed Josephine speculatively. He carried you 40 miles, did he? Josephine nodded, a blush warming her cheeks under the housekeeper's shrewd gaze. He saved my life. Mrs. Daniel's expression was unreadable. Well, he's a man who does what needs doing, our Mr. Prescott, always has been. She patted Josephine's hand. Now drink your tea and rest. Doctor's orders by way of Mr. Prescott's telegram. We'll talk more tomorrow. With that, she left Josephine alone with her thoughts, which inevitably turned to Matthew. In the context of Silvercrest, he seemed somehow different, more assured, more established than he had appeared on the trail. This was his domain, where his word carried weight and his judgment was respected. It added yet another dimension to the man who had already shown her so many facets of his character. The following days established a new routine for Josephine. Under Mrs. Daniels' watchful care, her strength returned rapidly, though her mobility remained limited by the cumbersome cast. Mr. Whitmore proved to be a considerate employer, visiting daily to check on her progress and discuss Abigail's education. My late wife began teaching Abby when she was small, he explained during one such visit. Reading, writing, basic mathematics. But Caroline always wanted more for her, a proper education that would prepare her for whatever life she chose. A progressive view, Josephine observed, impressed. Mr. Whitmore smiled, a touch of sadness in his eyes. Caroline was a progressive woman, daughter of a professor at Yale. She gave up a great deal to follow me west, but she never regretted it except perhaps the limited educational opportunities for Abby. I'll do my best to honor her wishes, Josephine promised, and so even before she could walk unaided, Josephine began teaching Abigail. The girl proved to be an eager and capable student, soaking up knowledge with an enthusiasm that reminded Josephine why she had chosen teaching as her profession. They started with an assessment of Abigail's current knowledge, then developed a curriculum that included literature, history, natural sciences, and mathematics. The library Mr. Whitmore had mentioned was indeed small but well-stocked, containing volumes that had clearly been selected with care by someone who valued education. Many bore inscriptions in a delicate feminine hand, "To my beloved Jacob," or, for our Abigail, touching reminders of the woman whose presence still lingered in the house. Matthew, meanwhile, was often absent during daylight hours, his duties as foreman keeping him busy from dawn until dusk. But he made a point of stopping by the house each evening, ostensibly to report to Mr. Whitmore, but inevitably finding his way to wherever Josephine happened to be. Sometimes these visits were brief, a few minutes of conversation, an inquiry about her comfort, an update on her healing progress. Other times, particularly after dinner, when Mr. Whitmore retired to his study and Abigail to her room, Matthew would linger longer, sharing stories of his day or listening as Josephine recounted her teaching experiences. During one such evening, about 2 weeks after their arrival at Silvercrest, they sat on the front porch, enjoying the cool night air. Josephine, able to move short distances with the aid of crutches, Mrs. Daniels had produced from some storage area, had been eager to escape the confines of the house. Dr. Porter says the cast can come off in another month, she mentioned, watching as Matthew whittled a small piece of wood with practiced hands. Sooner than he initially thought. Matthew nodded, seemingly absorbed in his task. That's good news. Yes, Josephine agreed, though uncertainty colored her tone. Though I'm not sure what comes after. This caught Matthew's attention. He looked up, his knife pausing. Once I'm healed, Josephine explained. I was hired to teach Abigail while I recover, but beyond that. She trailed off, the future suddenly seeming as vast and uncertain as the Nevada desert had been when the stagecoach abandoned her. You could stay, Matthew said quietly, his eyes returning to his whittling. Mr. Whitmore would want you to. Abigail's thriving under your instruction. Is that the only reason to stay? The question slipped out before Josephine could reconsider its implications. Matthew's hands stilled completely. Slowly, he set aside the wood and knife, turning to face her fully. In the moonlight, his expression was difficult to read, but his voice, when he spoke, held a depth of feeling that made Josephine's heart quicken. No, he said simply, that's not the only reason. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Josephine found herself thinking of their journey the way Matthew had carried her without complaint, his gentle hands setting her broken bone, the night they had shared a blanket in the lined shack. I never properly thanked you, she said finally, for saving my life. You've thanked me a dozen times, Matthew reminded her, a smile touching his lips. Not properly, Josephine insisted. Words seem inadequate for what you did. Matthew shook his head, dismissing her gratitude. I did what anyone would have done. That's not true, and we both know it. Josephine's voice grew firmer. Most people would have left me at the nearest settlement or sent someone back for me. You carried me 40 miles, Matthew, 40 miles. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I couldn't leave you, he said finally, his voice so low she had to lean closer to hear. From the moment I found you, leaving wasn't an option. The simple statement held such conviction that it took Josephine's breath away. Why? She asked softly. Matthew turned to her, moonlight silvering his features. Because sometimes a man knows in his bones what matters, what's worth any amount of hardship. His eyes held hers, unguarded for perhaps the first time since they'd met. You mattered, Josephine, you still do. The confession, delivered with such straightforward honesty, pierced straight to Josephine's heart. In Boston, men had courted her with flowery compliments and carefully crafted declarations. Matthew's simple truth outweighed them all. Matthew, she began, not entirely certain what she meant to say. Before she could continue, the front door opened, and Mr. Whitmore stepped onto the porch, unaware of the moment he had interrupted. Ah, Prescott, there you are. I wanted to discuss the new breeding stock before you turn in. Matthew rose, his expression closing like a book. Of course, sir. As the two men moved toward the other end of the porch, deep in discussion about cattle, Josephine remained where she was, her thoughts in turmoil. Matthew's words had confirmed what she had begun to suspect, that the connection she felt was not one-sided. But what did it mean for her future? For the independence she had sought when leaving Boston? The questions kept her awake long into the night as she weighed possibilities and examined her own heart with newfound clarity. The following weeks brought gradual but steady improvement to Josephine's condition. Under Mrs. Daniel's care, she regained her strength, moving from crutches to a walking stick as her leg healed within its plaster prison. Her teaching of Abigail continued, both of them finding joy in their daily lessons. And her place within the household solidified as she moved from guest to valued member of the Silvercrest family. Yet beneath the surface of this peaceful routine, tension simmered, not unpleasant, but undeniable. Every interaction with Matthew seemed charged with unspoken possibilities, every shared glance holding questions neither of them quite dared to voice aloud. They were rarely alone together, the busy life of the ranch providing few opportunities for private conversation. But occasionally, circumstances would align, a chance meeting in the library when the house was otherwise empty, a moment on the porch when others had retired, a brief exchange in the garden where Josephine had taken to spending time as her mobility improved. During one such encounter, as Josephine sat on a bench beneath a flowering apple tree, Matthew approached with a package in his hands. "Brought you something from town," he said, taking a seat beside her. Josephine accepted the package with surprise. "What's the occasion?" "No occasion," Matthew replied with a slight shrug. "Just saw it and thought of you." Unwrapping the brown paper, Josephine found a book, a newly published volume on astronomy. Her face lit with pleasure as she ran her fingers over the embossed cover. "For your lessons with Abigail," Matthew explained, "you mentioned wanting a more current text. It's perfect. Josephine said, genuinely touched by his thoughtfulness. How did you remember that? It was just a passing comment. Matthew's gaze held hers. I remember everything you say, Josephine. The simple statement, delivered without artifice, made her heart skip. Matthew, about what you said the other night, you don't need to say anything, he interrupted gently. I wasn't expecting a response, but I want to respond, Josephine insisted. I need to be sure of my own mind first. Matthew nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take all the time you need, I'm not going anywhere. As he rose to leave, Josephine caught his hand impulsively. Thank you for the book and for, she hesitated, searching for the right words, for seeing me. Not just as someone to rescue or help, but as myself. Matthew's fingers tightened briefly around hers. That's easy, Josephine. You're the most clearly yourself of anyone I've ever known. With that, he was gone, leaving Josephine to ponder the curious alchemy that had transformed a desperate rescue into something far more complex and precious. The day finally came when Dr. Porter, summoned from Verdi, pronounced Josephine's leg healed enough to remove the cast. The procedure was uncomfortable but brief, revealing a limb that seemed alarmingly pale and thin after its weeks of confinement. You'll need to strengthen it gradually, the doctor advised. Short walks at first, increasing distance as your comfort allows. The muscle will rebuild with use. That evening, a small celebration was held in honor of Josephine's recovery. Mrs. Daniels prepared a special dinner, Mr. Whitmore opened a bottle of fine whiskey, and even Abigail was allowed to stay up later than usual, her excitement at her teacher's progress evident in her animated chatter. Matthew arrived later than the others, having been delayed by ranch business. When he entered the dining room, his eyes immediately sought Josephine, widening slightly at the sight of her standing unaided near the fireplace. The cast is off, she said unnecessarily, a smile breaking across her face. So I see, Matthew replied, his own smile matching hers. How does it feel? Strange, Josephine admitted, weak but whole again. Throughout dinner, she was acutely aware of Matthew's presence across the table, of his quiet attention whenever she spoke, of the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. The awareness brought both comfort and a curious anticipation, as though they were approaching some unseen threshold together. After the meal, when Abigail had been sent to bed and Mr. Whitmore had retired to his study, Matthew approached Josephine as she stood near the parlor window, gazing out at the star-filled sky. Would you like to walk a bit? He asked. The doctor said it would be good for you. I'd like that, Josephine agreed, reaching for her shawl. They stepped outside into the cool evening air, Matthew offering his arm for support as they moved slowly along the path that circled the house. For several minutes, they walked in companionable silence, Josephine concentrating on the unfamiliar sensation of walking normally again, Matthew matching his pace to hers with careful consideration. You're doing well, he observed as they completed a full circuit without her needing to stop and rest. Better than I expected, Josephine admitted. Though I doubt I'll be running races anytime soon. Give it time, Matthew advised. You're stronger than you know. They paused near the garden, where moonlight silvered the late spring blossoms. Josephine turned to face him, suddenly certain of what she needed to say. I've been offered a permanent position here, she revealed. Mr. Whitmore asked me yesterday to stay on as Abigail's governess indefinitely. Matthew's expression gave nothing away. And what did you tell him? That I needed time to consider. Josephine took a deep breath. My original plan was Sacramento, a school of my own eventually, independence. I remember, Matthew said quietly. But plans change, Josephine continued, her voice growing steadier with each word. People change. These past weeks have shown me that independence doesn't have to mean being alone, that building something meaningful can happen anywhere with the right people. Hope kindled in Matthew's eyes, though he remained cautious. Are you saying you'll stay at Silvercrest? I'm saying I want to stay wherever you are, Josephine replied simply, if that's what you want to. For a moment, Matthew seemed frozen, as though he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. Then, with careful movements, he took both her hands in his. "From the moment I found you in the desert," he said, his voice low and fervent, "something inside me recognized you. Not just as someone who needed help, but as someone who belonged in my life." He shook his head slightly, as if marveling at the memory. "Carrying you those 40 miles wasn't a burden, Josephine. It was the most important journey of my life." Tears pricked at Josephine's eyes, but they were tears of happiness, not sorrow. "I think I began falling in love with you somewhere around mile 20, she confessed, "when you stopped to rest but refused to give up, even though you were exhausted beyond imagining." "Falling in love," Matthew repeated, wonder in his voice. "Is that what this is? Don't you know?" Josephine asked softly. In answer, Matthew drew her closer, one hand rising to gently cup her cheek. "I know that I've never felt for anyone what I feel for you," he said. "I know that the thought of you leaving Silvercrest makes the future seem empty. And I know that if you'll have me, Josephine James, I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret staying." "I'll have you," Josephine whispered, her heart so full it seemed impossible to contain all she felt. "On one condition." "Name it," Matthew said immediately. A smile curved Josephine's lips. "That you never carry me 40 miles again. 20 perhaps in an emergency, but 40 is excessive." Matthew's laugh was warm and rich, filled with joy and relief in equal measure. "You drive a hard bargain, Miss James." Then, growing serious again, he asked, "May I kiss you?" In answer, Josephine rose slightly on her tiptoes, closing the distance between them. Their first kiss was tentative, a gentle exploration. The second was surer, deepening as they each recognized the other's response. By the third, Josephine's arms had found their way around Matthew's neck, his encircling her waist with careful respect for her still healing leg. When they finally parted, breathless and a little dazed, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since I found you, and I love you," Josephine replied, the words feeling as natural as breathing, "enough to give up Sacramento for Nevada." "A significant sacrifice," Matthew acknowledged with a smile. "One I intend to make worthwhile." "You already have," Josephine assured him, thinking of all that had passed between them, the rescue that had become a journey, the journey that had become a beginning. They married that autumn in a ceremony attended by the entire ranch. Mr. Whitmore gave the bride away, Abigail served as maid of honor, and Mrs. Daniels cried unashamedly throughout the proceedings. The couple moved into a small house that Matthew had been building on Silvercrest property, close enough to the main house for Josephine to continue teaching Abigail, but private enough to start their own family. And when, a year later, their first child was born, a son they named James, after Josephine's family, Matthew would sometimes tell the sleeping infant the story of how he had carried his mother 40 miles across the Nevada wilderness, not knowing then that he was carrying his future in his arms. "It was the best 40 miles I ever walked," he would say, as Josephine listened from the doorway, her heart full of the love that had begun with a broken leg and a cowboy who refused to leave anyone behind. "And I'd walk 1,000 more to find your mother again." In the years that followed, as their family grew to include a daughter and another son, as Silvercrest prospered under Matthew's continued management, as Josephine established a small school that served the children of ranch hands and neighboring properties alike, they never forgot the journey that had brought them together. Each anniversary, they would walk a single mile together, hand in hand, a symbolic remembrance of the 40 miles that had changed their lives forever. And sometimes, on special occasions, Matthew would still carry Josephine across thresholds, through streams, or simply because she asked his arms as strong and sure as they had been on that first desperate day when fate had placed her in his path and written the beginning of their love story on the unforgiving landscape of the American West.